A very, very warm welcome to you all for this, our distinguished lecture in the series of talks and lectures which we have been doing this year to celebrate 40 years of women in Pembroke. Pembroke came very late to this party, we were, I think, I say to my shame, the third last college to admit women. Our academic results have soared ever since. We are very proud of the fact that we are now a wholly inclusive community. And we have wanted to celebrate the fact that we now are a college of women and men. And tonight's lecture is the high point of the talks that we have. Julia Gillard, former Prime Minister of Australia, and I'm going to ask Polly, our Master-elect, and Julia to come up onto the stage, and over to both of you. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us. To my delight, our guest speaker to deliver Pembroke's 40th anniversary distinguished lecture is Julia Gillard, who served as the 27th Prime Minister of Australia. The first and still the only woman to occupy that role, Julia has since dedicated her time to advocacy, governance roles, and writing, in each case with remarkable impact and reach. In 2021, Julia was appointed Chair of Wellcome, the global foundation which supports science to solve urgent health problems worldwide. She is the founder and the inaugural chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London, as well as chairing its sister institute at the Australian National University. And particularly as a lifelong advocate for increasing and equal access to education, Julia has served as chair of the Global Partnership of Education. She has led the Royal Commission into Early Childhood Education and Care in South Australia, and she chaired Beyond Blue, which is one of Australia's foremost mental health awareness bodies. She is the patron of CAMFED, and we welcome representatives from CAMFED tonight. Thank you for joining us, which is the Pan-African movement revolutionising the delivery of girls' education. Her books include My Story, based on her experiences as Prime Minister, the co-authored Women and Leadership, Real Lives, Real Lessons, and most recently, Not Now, Not Ever, which takes its title from the unforgettable misogyny speech that Julia delivered in the Australian Parliament in 2012. 13 years later, that speech is still an imperative watch. Friends, colleagues, and students, please join me in the signal honour of welcoming Julia Gillard to Pembroke. Julia.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be with all of you to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the admission of women at Pembroke College. A big hello to everyone in the audience and to the Australians in particular who have been confined to the gallery upstairs. Not entirely sure why, but presumably that's an honour, not being, put to the sideline. This college is steeped in so much history. It's quite incredible to contemplate that it was founded in 1347, meaning, of course, that for more than 600 years of its existence, the college was a men's-only place of learning. And then finally, the historic decision to admit women. But not until the merits had been debated. After all, there were big issues to consider. Would women be too much of a distraction for the hard-working male scholars? Perhaps they'd be a bit too emotional for the rigours of education here. Apparently, and I quote from an account of the events leading up to women being admitted to Pembroke, quote, "The days of anxious debate over exactly how many undergraduate rooms ought to be fitted out with long mirrors, and to what extent fellows should be equipped with boxes of Kleenex when interviewing young ladies for admission, these all passed rapidly into folklore." Of course, it's easy for all of us to smile at these lines decades later. However, back then the debate was serious. Indeed, in 1974, a working group investigated existing mixed colleges and ended up arguing a major problem was an apparent shortage of women with a demonstrably high enough standard to match the perceived standard of the existing male entrants. I'm pleased, and I'd have to say very unsurprised to say, as is so often the case, statistics showed the women were being severely underestimated. There was no significant difference between the standards of the more than 2,000 men and around 450 women attending the other Cambridge colleges at the time. And it also became clear there was a huge pool of untapped talent. Hundreds of young women sitting entrance exams who were achieving admission standards but were nevertheless not being admitted. Not to mention all the women who were simply not applying because they knew how exceptionally difficult it was to get in, or they weren't allowed to stay on long enough in their earlier studies. Which should also leave us aghast at how much human potential was wasted in the centuries before. Once admitted, as usual, women got on with the job, and in the 40 years since, Pembroke has produced so many incredible women alumni who are now taking the skills that were nurtured here into their professions in countries across the globe. From sporting successes like Elspeth Fowler and rower Catherine Bishop, to diplomat and former ambassador to Myanmar, Vicky Bowman, and Hollywood actress Naomi Harris. Doctors, lawyers, scientists, filmmakers, journalists, Pembroke women on every continent are doing this college proud. And as of October this year, another milestone for women at Pembroke, I want to extend my congratulations to Professor Polly Blakesley on being appointed the first woman master of Pembroke. I know a little about the honour and challenges of being the first woman to step into a role. And Polly, I regret to advise you the news isn't all good. From my own experiences and from research done by the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London, an institute I have the honour of chairing, we know that barriers still exist. For women, there tends to be a disproportionate focus on appearance because images of leadership have been male for so long, a different look jars. There also tends to be more interest in family structures. Even the newest female political candidate knows that there is no right answer to the question, do you have children? If you don't, then that raises suspicions about whether you are a cold person. If you do, then heavens, who's looking after them? A question not asked of young male candidates with children because no one assumes they have the major caring responsibility. This is just one manifestation of what research studies constantly tell us, namely that all of us, every one of us, including young people, have embedded in our brains gender stereotypes, and we have very specific stereotypes when it comes to leadership. We associate competence and command with men and tend to see male leaders as likeable, whereas women are associated with empathy and nurturing and we tend to see female leaders as nasty because being in charge is counterintuitive to our stereotyping. On the competence point, a very persuasive study was conducted at North Carolina State University, which had a wholly online course taught to 4 different classes by a male lecturer and a female lecturer. As a result of the particular way this course was delivered, students never met or saw the teacher. This enabled the male teacher to teach one class, disclosing his true identity, and the female teacher to teach another, disclosing her true identity. But for classes 3 and 4, they effectively switched genders, with the woman teaching the course pretending to be the man and vice versa. When the male teacher's performance was evaluated by students, he was marked down by those who believed him to be a woman, compared with those who believed him to be a man. The female teacher scored better with those who believed her to be male, compared to those who thought she was a woman. Obviously, the calibre of his and her teaching did not change. The only thing that did was the students' perception of their gender. On the stereotypes of empathy and nurturing, a study of the male-dominated field of engineering found that a confident male engineer would gain influence in his organisation, but for a woman to do the same, confidence alone was not enough. She would need to be seen as both competent and caring. Academic researchers like Laurie A. Rudman and Peter Glick have conducted experiments on attitudes towards women and men and have shown that a nice, considerate woman is just seen as conforming to expectations, so her behaviour does not generate a positive reaction from her employer, whereas a man will get a good response because he will be seen to have gone above and beyond usual behavioural norms. Indeed, being seen as a helpful colleague has been shown to correlate with employment promotions for men, but not for women. But it is important to note here that while the research I am citing now focuses on women, the fact we don't have gender equality has negative impacts on men as well. Other research has shown that men also pay a price when they are in a counter-stereotypical occupation. For example, a male nurse has to prove his competence and his caring attributes more than a female nurse because instinctively he is not who we expect to show up. Yet, if we look around the world today, we see plenty of evidence that gender equality is not viewed as a shared and positive agenda for all. I can give you some numbers to support that assertion, because each year the global polling company Ipsos, in partnership with the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, looks at attitudes to gender equality. Released earlier this month, the study this year was based on a survey of nearly 24,000 people across 30 nations. It found that 44% of respondents agreed with the statement that we have gone so far in promoting women's equality that we are discriminating against men. That's an interesting insight, but far more fascinating and disturbing is the age and gender breakdown behind that number. 6 in 10 Gen Z men, the youngest men in the sample, 6 in 10 agree men are being expected to do too much to support equality, 22 points higher than the 4 in 10 Gen Z women who feel the same. The next biggest gap is amongst the next age cohort up, Gen X, where there is a 17-point difference in opinion between men and women. And it is the oldest generation surveyed, baby boomers, that's people my age and above, who are least likely to say men are being asked to do too much, with 44% of men and 31% of women in this group feeling this way. Let's just pause for a moment and have that sink in. It means if you found yourself at a birthday party for a 70-year-old with the celebrating crowd largely in the same age bracket, you are statistically more likely to meet men supportive of gender equality than if you went to a 21st. And the worrying news doesn't stop there. Asked whether a man who stays home to look after his children is less of a man, 28% of Gen Z men agree strongly or agree. Amongst those ageing baby boomers on the dance floor at the 70th birthday party, only 12% of men express the same view. Our survey also shows that Gen Z is a divided generation. 53% of Gen Z women say they define themselves as a feminist, compared with 32% of Gen Z men, a gap of 21 percentage points. This is the biggest gender split amongst generations surveyed. And seemingly, Gen Z knows they are a divided generation. In fact, Gen Zers are relatively united in their belief that there's tension between men and women in society today. While tension between several other groups in society, such as between rich and poor, is felt equally across generations, as shown in our survey, there is a much clearer age divide in perceptions of tension between men and women in society. 6 in 10 members of Gen Z across the 30 countries surveyed say there is tension between men and women today, the most of any generation surveyed. And majorities of both Gen Z men, 55%, and women, 62%, agree this is the case. Let's turn now to how these attitudes show up in the real world. In the US election, which gave us Donald Trump as president, analysis presented in the New York Times shows that among voters who are younger than 26 years old, Kamala Harris only gained more than 50% of support from voters who were women of colour. White men, white women, and men of colour all supported Trump at rates over 50%. However, it's worth noting that in both race categories, people of colour and white, women more strongly supported Harris than men. When the New York Times dug into these figures, they found that the gender gap between women and men has been fairly stable among voters over 40 years old, with women more strongly supporting the Democrats. The margin is around 10% and has historically been explained by women's greater focus on social sector issues like healthcare, where Democrats have a brand advantage. But in the election last November, if you look at people younger than 25, the voting gap doubles, the gender gap doubles to nearly 20 percentage points, with young men much more solidly behind Trump. The phenomenon is not just happening in the US. Polling and election outcomes last year showed this trend of gender polarisation in younger voters in many parts of the world, including here in the UK, with younger women far more progressive than younger men. I think New York Times columnist Ezra Klein caught our collective reaction to these facts well when he said, and I quote, "The thing I'm most shocked by in the last 4 years is that young people have gone from being the most progressive generation since baby boomers, and maybe in some ways more so, to becoming potentially the most conservative generation we have experienced in 50 to 60 years, and this is being driven especially by young men. Why? No one knows the full answer to that, but now there is a huge drive to understand it. The acclaimed new series, Adolescence, is one way and shows that the creative industries are now trying to grapple with and invite us to reflect on what's happening. At a more academic level, at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, we are endeavouring to mount a major research project into attitude formation by young men. It's always dangerous to posit an explanation before all the data and analysis is in, but intuitively, I would put three potential factors to you. One, young men are doing it tougher today. The statistics on comparative educational attainment and income generation capacity are truly concerning. Indeed, here in the UK, for the first time, it is young men rather than young women who are more likely to be out of work and out of school. Second, today's generation has had more of their gender attitudes formed whilst immersed in the online environment, with anti-women elements encompassing everything from early access to violent pornography to the incel movement and the manosphere. Third, today's generation likely saw extra programs for girls when they were in school, an understandable response to the then existing educational disadvantages facing girls. Perhaps that has left them feeling undervalued. And maybe there is some old-fashioned things like acting out against a more empowered generation of mothers who likely worked as well as cared for children and had a sense of their own equality. Young people acting out to distinguish themselves from their parents is a well-known norm, and maybe this acting out by young men is reacting against their more empowered mothers. But wherever the research takes us, as the Trump administration shreds diversity, equity and inclusion policies with ripple effects on businesses, universities and organisations throughout the world, we have to be prepared to act. In my own mind, I label this task resist, reflect, re-energise. We have to resist when confronted with egregious claims like plane accidents are being caused by DEI policies or the most oppressed group is white South Africans. We also have to uphold here and in my home country of Australia and in other parts of the world the legal and practical efforts to improve equality. While many fashions start in America, this anti-DEI crusade is not one we should follow. But we also have to deeply reflect and work out why the project of gender equality does not have greater support. We have to acknowledge that we have not done enough to include men and boys, that we have allowed the impression to settle that this is all about women and more for women will inevitably mean less for men. This is untrue in every sense. Eradicating gender-based barriers will be better for everyone. We also have to reflect on the widespread failure to pursue in businesses and other organisations DEI policies that actually work. For years now, at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, we have been sounding a warning bell about two things: the attitudes of young men and the wasted time and effort in gender equality programs that have no impact or even a negative impact. People can tell when they are being asked to do something that doesn't make a difference. We have to do better. But even as we think through a more inclusive narrative and better tools for change, we have to be out on the field with energy and enthusiasm. While we might not yet have every answer, we can all find ways of pursuing change. This can be incredibly local, national, or very global. Efforts at this college, in this university, in your family, in your community, in your future career, all matter and make an impact. We wouldn't be here tonight if earlier generations hadn't fought for change. Without the tireless advocacy and often painful sacrifices of our foremothers and forefathers, the landscape of opportunities available to women would be drastically different. From the suffragettes who endured imprisonment and social ostracisation to secure the right to vote, to the women who challenged discriminatory laws in the workplace, to those who had the burden of privilege of being the first to ever hold a position, each victory has chipped away at deeply entrenched systems of inequality. Similarly, the fight for reproductive rights and protection against gender-based violence have been and continue to be long and arduous battles, with each advancement representing a hard-won victory against societal resistance. The cultural shifts that have redefined societal expectations of women are also a product of sustained activism. The challenging of traditional gender roles, the insistence on equal representation in media and politics, and the demand for respect and autonomy in personal relationships are all outcomes of generations of women refusing to accept the status quo. The progress is a direct reflection of the courage and determination of those who came before us, and a reminder that the fight for true equality is an ongoing process. Tonight, we focus on the hard-won access to higher education and professional careers, women and supportive men who campaigned to gain entry into Cambridge University, into this college, building on the work of the so-called blue stockings who cultivated intellectual spaces in the 18th century. Their efforts laid the groundwork for today's female doctors, lawyers, scientists, politicians, and business leaders. The ability for women to pursue independent financial security and contribute to society on an equal footing with men is not a given. It is a legacy built upon decades of struggle. And tonight, while we celebrate 40 years of women being able to study right here, we do so knowing that tomorrow that struggle continues and we all have a part to play. I thank you.
Julia, what an arresting speech with some pretty chastening data, statistics and research, and clearly the work of your Global Institute for Women's Leadership could not be more necessary, imperative and timely. I kind of feel I want to start, I don't want to in any way deny the chastening aspect of what you've been talking about, but I wanted to start with a question that was submitted that was possibly looking to the uplands. Can you give us examples of leaders or countries that have introduced good policies for gender equality? What is helping us shift the dial?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. At Welcome, where I have the honour of chairing the board, we have a Norwegian CEO, so he's heard me use this example and he loves it because it's an example from Norway. And many of the Scandinavian countries have been at the forefront of gender equality projects, and you would see each year when the World Economic Forum brings out its rankings of countries based on gender equality, it's normally the Norway, the Scandinavian nations who are at the top. But a clear example is the Norwegian approach to family leave, where in a male-female couple, both partners have their own entitlement to family leave, the same amount of family leave on the birth of a child. If the father chooses not to take that leave, then it's lost. He cannot transfer the entitlement to the mother. Some systems in other countries enable that to happen. So both partners have their entitlement. Routinely, both partners take the leave. They sequence it, so the woman is at home when the baby is at its smallest, and then she returns to work and the man takes the sort of second shift when the baby is a little bit bigger. And that policy has shown in better patterns of shared care in parenting even 5 years later. So it puts you on a pathway where you've got equal workplace entitlements, but it brings you to equal sharing of domestic and caring work at home. And we need both sides of the equation, what happens at work and what happens at home, to be equal if men and women are truly going to have an equal future. So definitely a policy that works.
Phenomenal example. I appreciate the demographic in this room might not help me here, but I do want to ask, could you raise your hand if you have experience either personally or within your close social groups of that sort of pattern of shared parental leave? Anyone?
A few.
A few. Great. I hope by the time I come to the end of being master, if I might ask the same question, there might be a few more hands in the air, because it's what's brilliant about your example is the follow-on research. You know, that it's been around long enough now to know what the impact is on 5+-year-olds. So that's crucial. Reflecting a bit more on the obviously less uplifting developments you alluded to in your speech, and the polarised political landscape that we are all reeling from, and have been for some time, but especially this year. How do we make sure that gender equality is a bipartisan issue? How do we make sure it doesn't get, weaponised in different ways by different parties? Have you got thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, policies become bipartisan when they've won deep community support, and both sides of politics, all sides of politics in a multi-party system, come to the conclusion that whatever their original policy predisposition, there is now no point trying to contest this with the community. To give you a real-world example of that from my home from Australia, our public health system is called Medicare. Its forerunner was introduced by the Gough Whitlam Labor government in the early 1970s, Medibank. It was a ferociously partisan debate, Labor introducing the new system, the Conservative opposition resisting it. When government changed and the Conservatives came into government, they repealed Medibank. Then when a Labor government, the Hawke Labor government, was elected in the 1980s, they put in place the current system, Medicare. That was against ferocious opposition by the Conservatives. And then as years went on, it became apparent to the Conservatives that the Australian community really liked Medicare, they liked the health support, and the Conservatives basically dropped campaigning against Medicare, and once they dropped it, they jumped profoundly on the other foot and started wandering around describing themselves as the best friends Medicare had ever had. A politician's adroitness for seemingly able to forget, sort of 20 years of political history. And that endures to this day in Australia. No one from any political perspective would present for an election saying, let's get rid of Medicare. So if you really want to make it bipartisan, you've got to win the hearts and minds in the community. You've got to show it can work, Medicare was working, and win the hearts and minds in the community. And in line with what I said during the talk, this is, I think, what we failed to do. We've had a narrative around gender equality which has been too divisive, that hasn't included men and boys. We clearly have underestimated the pressures on young men and perhaps some of the toxicity in the online environment, leading to new and more negative attitude formation towards gender equality. And I think we also have seen people asked to do things that they know aren't impactful. So not working and divisive. We've got to address both of those things. We need it to work and we need it to be popular. And I think the deep period of reflection we're in now is about how we achieve those two objectives.
Thank you, thank you. I suppose a follow-on question, which I think came from someone sitting close to me now, it's about the rise of authoritarianism. We're witnessing this, and with enormous concern, we're witnessing it not just in historically undemocratic nations, but also in historically democratic nations. And with that is coming resistance to and challenge to independent judiciaries, to regulatory bodies, to independent expertise. And there's that real concern about that in terms of global stability. What are your thoughts on that, and how do we respond to it?
I mean, we don't know yet, but I do wonder whether a unexpected, though welcome byproduct of the way the Trump administration is conducting itself is that the demonstration effect of the Trump administration is actually undermining far-right political parties and more authoritarian trends in other democracies. I mean, before the election of Trump, when Harris and Trump were contending, or even going back to the period when it was Biden and Trump, you would look around the world and you would say to yourself, okay, we've got Trump campaigning for the presidency in the US, we've got the AfD on the move in Germany, we've got Le Pen on the move in France. We can predict probably the results of the next Canadian election with a shift to the right, not necessarily a shift into authoritarianism, but certainly a shift into more Trump-like politics, and the list would have gone on. Now I actually think, and the polling is starting to show this, that political leaders around the world from mainstream political parties, Keir Starmer here, President Macron in France, I think it's certainly shown in Canada in absolutely a huge degree, that those who are standing out against the Trump administration are getting community support. Now, too early to say, okay, that means some of the earlier signs in democracies of moving towards more autocratic political parties, that's all fixed. I'm not putting that case, but I think it's an interesting dynamic right now. Having said that, it's not just liberal democracies where we need to worry about the rise of authoritarianism. There are obviously very concerning events in Turkey. We've seen concerning events in many other nations, in India and in other places around the world. So there is still, I think, lots to remind us that democracy is a very fragile thing. And without people thinking about it, nurturing it, investing in it, explaining its merits, it is easily pushed into retreat. There is a lot to think about here about the interplay of media, how people get their information, and more polarised and potentially more authoritarian politics. And I think, you know, with the social media companies getting ever more irresponsible, you know, as they fall in line with the Trump administration, the campaigning that we need to do about regulating the online environment is a key democratic objective. There is evidence in the US about people being more prepared to vote for Trump, being less likely in surveys to say that they think democracies are the best way of organising things, and exposure to TikTok. So there is a dynamic here, and we need to unpack that and I think respond with regulation.
There is work.
There is work.
There is work to do. There is work to do. Now, conscious as I am of many Australians in the room, and a very warm welcome to you. Some of you are well known to us. Some of you may be visiting Pembroke for the first time. We're delighted to have you here. So I did want to shift our attention a bit to Australia.
Right.
How could we not? I'm wondering what there is in Australian political culture, as opposed to, for the sake of argument, Canadian or French, that we in Britain could do well to learn from, and whether there's any lessons you also think might translate well the other way. So is there, I might be, this might be in my mind, but what are the particular connections that could benefit our very different countries, but we do have some shared
Yes.
cultural ground?
Well, I think something we could learn from you is the UK, Britain, the Parliament, much more polite than our Parliament, much more polite.
Seriously?
Seriously, much
My
more
goodness.
polite. We look on at your quaint way of doing Prime Minister's questions only every so often, and we are bemused by it, but that's not how we do it in Australia. In Australia, there's question time every day, an hour and a half. The Prime Minister's expected to be in it every day. You would either have to be at the most important international conference in the world or in a hospital bed. There would be no other excuses for not going to question time. And we have a furiously adversarial system. When we have visitors from the British Parliament come and sit in the gallery, you can see them walk out afterwards going, oh my God, what on earth was that? So we could probably use some politeness from you, learn a bit about that. I think in terms of our political system, I would advocate a few things. People might say, well, she would say that, wouldn't she? Because, she's coming to just advocate Australian things, but I genuinely think they're important. We have compulsory voting. I am a huge believer in compulsory voting. I'm a huge believer that citizenship gives you rights, but it also gives you responsibilities, and one of your responsibilities is voting. And it does mean that our politics sort of coheres in a much more mainstream way. I wouldn't necessarily do the contrast with the UK, because despite voluntary voting, you still have quite high voting rates. But comparing it with, say, the US, where the game is really about getting out to the polls highly motivated minorities, our politics, because of compulsory voting, coheres around mainstream views. So I think compulsory voting is very important. We have a multi-preferential system for our House of Representatives, which I believe ends up with fairer results than first past the post. You need to number every square, and so you have to make choices about every political party. It's described as a system that means the person who wins is the least disliked, and there might be merit in that view, but it also means you don't get the sort of odd phenomenon here where you can say the majority of people in an electorate wanted a more progressive view, but the Conservative has won. So, an electorate where Labor might get, have to make up the numbers on the spot here, see if I can get this right. Labor might get, 45% of the vote, or not get 40% of the vote. Maybe the Greens get, 11% of the vote. And I think you're entitled to assume most people who vote Green probably wanted to vote progressively. If they couldn't have the Green candidate, they were more likely to want the Labor candidate. But in your system, if the rest of the electorate had voted Conservative, then the Conservative would win, notwithstanding that Labor vote and that Green vote. In Australia, with our preferential system, the people, everybody, but just focusing on the people who voted Green, they'd put one for the Greens and then they'd be looking at the other two, Conservative, Labor, and then they'd have to put a 2 and they'd have to put a 3. And if my thesis is right, then the 2 would have gone in the Labor box. When the Greens candidate is excluded from the count, those votes will go at full value to Labor. So I think that's a system with real merits as well. We have this kooky thing called an elected upper house.
Who knew?
You may one day want to try it.
We may give it a go. It's interesting, your suggestion of what the compulsory vote was a question submitted from a member of our audience tonight. And forgive me if I just do another quick poll, because we have a lot of people in this room who will have gained the vote reasonably recently, by which I mean in the last, for the sake of argument, 5 years. I'd love to know, could you put your hands up if you think we should have a compulsory vote in the UK? Okay, I think the floor has it, but that's really it. Somebody there's doing a kind of changing their mind.
Let me just suggest a couple of other innovations. We vote on a Saturday. Lot to recommend it. Most of our polling places are schools. It means the parents group runs sausage sizzles and cake stalls and all of that kind of stuff. So it has a bit of a festival atmosphere and raises some money for the local schools. So well known is this now that the sausages sold in bread are referred to as democracy sausages. So that's a good thing. We close the polls at 6 p.m, which means you don't have to stay up all night to get the results. More sleep, happier households, just a suggestion.
Why have we not thought of this before? This is absolutely revolutionary. I can't miss the opportunity. We've been talking in more general sort of policy ideas, abstract ideas, but we do have you, Julia Gillard, in the room. How did you prepare for that combative parliamentary debate that you've described? We're circling back to women in leadership. What did you do to prepare for that day in, day out, knowing the bear pit that was ahead of you?
Yeah, it's sort of, I look back on it now and part of what I came to do as a politician is to show that a woman could not only survive but thrive in that adversarial environment, which was Australian Parliament House, because the fashionable view when I was coming up through the Labor ranks, and it was a fashionable view on all sides of politics, was that women couldn't dominate the parliamentary chamber, and I look back on that as an objective now, and it's sort of curious to me because I can see at this stage of my life just how much that sort of adversarial environment, the screaming and shouting, the name calling, has actually diminished Parliament in the eyes of the public. And maybe I should have been more of a revolutionary when I was younger and have asked the question, can we do this very differently than trying to dominate the system as I found it? And then I think to myself, maybe the person who comes first has got no choice, the woman who comes first, but to dominate the system as she found it, to show that a woman can do it. And maybe it's the people who come afterwards, particularly the women who come afterwards, who then have the greatest space to try and put ideas about reshaping the system. Not sure, something to think about. But, you know, I basically honed my craft. I mean, you go from being the parliamentary backbencher who's shaking like a leaf if they get the opportunity to ask a question in question time, through to, you know, I ended up, when we were in opposition, leading our tactics as leader of opposition business, through to being the sort of, you know, Deputy Prime Minister and the one often called upon to do the hardest hitting during question time, to being Prime Minister. So I had a long run up. I mean, lots of women say to me about that speech, oh, I could never do something like that. And I'm like, well, number one, if you start doing it on the bus, you're probably going to get arrested. So that's a problem. But number two, these are learned skills, and I couldn't have done that the first day I was in Parliament either. I mean, mostly the preparation for question time, you'd have enormous briefing books because you could be asked any question about any aspect of government policy. But you knew as the day wore on what the media was interested in that day, and normally the opposition would be following what the media story of the day was, so it would close in to getting asked anything about anything, to, you know, questions very likely to focus on the media agenda, and you prepare for those. And on the day of the misogyny speech, that's what I did. There was a particular political issue which meant that question time was very likely to be on issues of sexism, so I prepared for question time. And I've joked that I asked my staff to get together Tony Abbott's top 10 sexist quotes, and they ran away for 5 minutes and came back with them. It wasn't a hard job. And so I went in, you know, ready for question time. But as it happened, the Leader of the Opposition, Tony Abbott, moved to an immediate debate. So the speech you see, the misogyny speech, was given off the cuff. I didn't know I was going to be giving a speech. I did sort of 2 or 3 handwritten notes about the order I wanted to put things whilst he was speaking, because he spoke first, and I had his quotes in my hand, and I gave the speech off that. And I think one of the things that shows in the speech is the immediacy of it, but the immediacy of it in that moment, but against the backdrop of years of practice in the Parliament.
I am slightly astonished by that. If you haven't watched it, go home, get on YouTube, watch the misogyny speech, and remember what we've learned tonight, that Julia did that off the cuff. Please do that. I, for one, am in utter awe. It does not look like something, it looks impassioned, but I've always wanted to ask you how much you prepared, and oh my goodness, it's notes in the room. That is extraordinary. That speech has had astounding impact, and one of the legacies is your great book, Not Now, Not Ever. 10 years later, so 2022, Julia's book comes out on the impact and the legacy, but I wondered if you could reflect on that a bit, because clearly now we know you weren't, it's not a thing that you've been, I hear you about, you spent years to be able to do that, but it's not something that you had, you know, 2 hours earlier in the day to craft. No. It's something that you are kind of delivering from the brain and from the heart in the moment. So what do you make of its impact? And just, I don't want to end on a downbeat note, but, you know, we are witnessing the rise of so much misogynist discourse. You've mentioned Adolescence, co-written by an honorary fellow of Pembroke, and we are super proud of him. But could you just reflect on the impact of the misogyny speech?
Yeah, I mean, its afterlife has certainly taken me by surprise. I mean, I knew on the day I delivered it in Parliament that it had landed as a powerful speech in the Parliament. You can tell that by the dynamics of the chamber. But I never expected it to just keep on and on and on and on, and here we are all these years later. And, you know, it's brought me some very unusual moments in my life, like going to the theatre in Adelaide and watching the play Julia, where a woman plays me. It's a fiction, it's an Australian playwright, a woman called Joanna Murray-Smith, who's imagined things about my life and brought that to stage. I went to see it with my sister, who at the end of it said to me, because it reflects on our childhood, at the end of it said to me, "We never used to watch that program that they referred to when we were young." I'm like, right, we're on the big picture here, Alison. But it was an unusual experience, and she ends the play by delivering the speech in full. So it's, yes, brought some very unusual moments for me. I think in many ways the speech has sort of had its afterlife because it's become divorced from the parliamentary context in which it was given. In some ways it's almost become divorced from me. It's, I think it's sort of continued to have a resonance because women know that they're still going out in a gender unequal world, and many of them sort of use that speech as listening to it as a sort of battle anthem to get ready for times when they know that they're going to have confrontations or difficult moments in that unequal world. And, originally I sort of resented a bit that I'd been in Parliament for all of these years. I'd been Deputy Prime Minister, I'd been Prime Minister, and the only thing anybody ever asked me about was that speech in the years afterwards. But I'm very at peace with it now. I'm self-knowing enough about Parliament and politics to know most Prime Ministers don't get remembered for anything. So if you can be remembered for one thing, that's pretty good. And clearly that's the thing I'm going to be remembered for, so that's nice. In the years since, I think some things have got better, some things have got worse, but in this world where we are now, we're going to continue to need our fortitude and our battle anthems and our collective action and our looking after each other and our bringing the next and newest generation through. And that's going to be a shared project about men and women who want to be participants in the process of change. So whilst I am predicting some choppy waters for all of us in the next few years ahead, I continue to be a very long-term optimist about where we're going to get to. I have a podcast, and I interviewed a wonderful activist for a forthcoming episode of the podcast, and we were talking about all of these things. And she said to me at one point, this is the dying kick of the patriarchy. That's what's going on now. This is the dying kick. And I'm not sure that's true, but I'm preferring to believe it's true than anything else right now. So maybe that gives people some hope as we go on.
I can't think of a better note to end on, but can I first of all say you are not going to be remembered just for the misogyny speech. You are going to be remembered for so much more. And can I say, I believe, especially at the moment, Julia's foundation and leadership of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, it is, as we heard, doing crucial grassroots research that demonstrates how people are perceived and how that enables them to thrive, to flourish, to lead, or restricts in that. So that is up there for me. Please can you join me in thanking Julia Gillard for astonishing contribution to our thinking and our advancement today. Thank you.
Thank you.